Quico Toro, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me again.
I thought about it. I wasn't sure, but I thought, you've written a whole book, so why not?
Yeah, seems like a moment.
Listen, so you have written with our mutual friend Moisés Naím a great new book about charlatans. Charlatans have always existed, right? I mean, you go back to the first human settlements, and presumably there was already charlatans around. What makes charlatans particularly interesting or important in this moment?
Well, yeah, I mean, I always think of the story of the golden calf in Exodus. Whoever made that was clearly making up some stories about its magical power. So
the Elizabeth Holmes of the Old Testament.
That's right. They've clearly always been around, but I think the reason we wanted to write this book is that when you read about charlatans in the olden days, there used to be really only a couple of types of charlatans that were very common, right? So you had get-rich-quick schemes or like snake oil, like cure-alls and, health-related scams. And you can see why, because those are two things. Those are very broad nets, right? Many people have health problems. If you have a health problem, you dream of like having a healthy body again. And like almost everybody would rather be rich and not be rich. So for thousands of years, these were the things that if you were standing on a soapbox in the market trying to like hoodwink people, you had a pretty good chance of meeting a mark just from a random set of people. But what's changed in the last few years is that suddenly we have all these technologies that allow different prospective charlatans to sort of micro-target the people that they want to get at. And so we've seen this explosion in the types of charlatanism that we see. Now, it's not just get rich quick and get well. It's things like connecting with aliens, or you are very depressed and suicidal and you dream of not wanting to kill yourself. Or true love, or like all kinds of different approaches, making America great again, or racial reconciliations. There are many, many different kinds of things that people have in their minds that they're like really committed to. And now charlatans have the technology to find those audiences and to build new kinds of communities of followers and to exploit them in like new and creative ways. So it's just really interesting.
Why do you think it's become that much broader? I mean, presumably in the past there must have been some things other than get rich quick schemes or get well schemes. I imagine, for example, that people, I don't know if we want to count that as charlatanism or not, wanted to sell spiritual salvation. I mean, in a sense, you could say that the whole Catholic Church for a few centuries, when it was selling indulgences, turned itself into an institutionalized charlatan saying, if only you pay, 100 golden ducats, then you're gonna get 500 years less of being tortured in purgatory. How do we define charlatanism, and how does that help to answer the question of why you think there's more of them around today?
Well, look, we define charlatan as somebody who connects with a prior belief that you're very committed to, and then interposes themselves between you and that belief. So they usually start by creating this link, and then they make these assertions of having access to some kind of special knowledge or some particular kind of power that normal people don't have. And then they manipulate you into believing that the things that you really believe deeply in can only come true in the world through them. Right. So, yeah, I think there are many charlatans in the book who take religious themes and exploit people on the basis of these religious themes. I mean, sometimes people think, well, are they saying that all religions are based on charlatans? And that's not at all what we're saying, because there is a harm standard, too. Like the thing that defines a charlatan as a charlatan is the string of broken lives that they leave in their wake. And when you look, well, certainly at mainstream religions now, there's a lot of social science research on this. People who are religiously observant, whether they're Catholics, Protestants, Jews, Muslims, people who actually participate in religious communities are healthier than everyone else. They're usually happier than everyone else. They're more embedded in their communities. They have stronger social connections than people who don't do those things. So there's certainly no sense that you've destroyed their lives.
But how do we define harm then, right? Because I'm imagining some extreme religious cult or a spiritual cult, a yoga guru that takes all your money, that alienates you from your family, but that for some lost people may actually, on net, make them happier, right? Perhaps if you didn't end up getting bound up with that community, you would end up as a drug addict, as an alcoholic, perhaps you'd end up killing yourself. And even as this community is completely exploiting you, is selling you something that is complete BS, that is made up by, some 32-year-old on ayahuasca, if the standard is, would your life be worse if you had never encountered this? Perhaps for many people it would be, but for some people it might not be, right? For some people it may turn out that their life goes relatively better devoting themselves, to this ridiculous spiritual quackery or to this cult, than it would have done otherwise.
And you're getting at one of the hard knobs that makes writing about this so difficult is that across the board, what you see is that when you attack a charlatan, the number one people there to defend them are the people inside the charlatans movement, right? And in many cases, charlatanism includes an aspect of financial fraud, and it makes it extremely hard to prosecute people who are taking advantage of victims who then show up and not only refuse to press charges, but will go and protest it on behalf of the charlatan. You're asking a really deep question, actually deeper than the way that we'd really conceived it. As we see it, the people inside the lives of charlatans' victims, their family members, the people close to them, the people dearest to them, normally have no trouble identifying the harms that charlatans make. And oftentimes, after the spell is broken, people come out and sort of sheepishly come to understand that it's almost like called deconditioning. People need to then begin to rebuild their lives. Because what a charlatan does is they manipulate your identity against you, right? So when you break free from a charlatan, now you have to rebuild your identity on a different basis. And that's really hard.
And so that gets to what we're offering, right? Which is, you argue at each stage and with each individual, you're going to be susceptible to a particular charlatan who promises to deliver on your most deeply cherished hopes, to avert your most deeply held fears. That, when Cypriot turned up in the Republic of Venice at a time when Venice was declining and was economically in a downward spiral, and everybody felt that they were being shoved from the sunlight in political terms. He said, I'm going to be able to produce gold. And through this alchemy, you're going to be rich and relive your golden age. So how do they produce this sort of product market fit, to speak with contemporary marketing parlance? Are charlatans always sort of brilliant at reading you exactly? Is it just that they offer some kind of pitch and they see who shows up? I mean, how do they manage to exploit these deepest hopes and fears?
In a way, it's not actually that difficult. And the story of Mamuña in Venice in the 1580s is a kind of a classic example. It wasn't exactly a secret that the nobility and the city fathers of Venice were deeply freaked out because their city had been a superpower, and now they were being cut out of these trade routes because now the Portuguese could sail directly to India, and the Spanish had this new empire in the Americas, and suddenly there was no point in Venice, and you can't sustain your status as a superpower. So and they were broke. The city was broke. So it's not exactly a secret that these people really don't want this, and that the problem is money. For something like at a time when alchemy was widely believed in, for someone like Mamuña to turn up in Venice and let it be known that he had found the Philosopher's Stone. Of course he understood that once he said that, people were going to line up behind him. And the interesting thing is that all a charlatan really has to do, not have to change anybody's minds. They don't try to change people's minds, usually. That's too hard, and it doesn't really work. What they do is they figure out what people already believe, and then they just champion it. But they champion it with like charisma and with like verve, And so when there's that thing in the world that you need to see happen, the thing that like if it doesn't happen, the world doesn't make sense to you, and somebody comes along and makes the strongest, most appealing case for that, man, our cognitive defenses are super weak against that stuff. And it's natural. It's completely normal that we fall for people who reflect our own deepest values to us. It's just that when the people doing that are unscrupulous and don't feel any remorse and just want to manipulate you, that puts you in a very bad position.
So you were speaking about the victim of this manipulation, and you're saying that what they have in common, presumably they're very different from each other in all kinds of dimensions, is that they have some deep hope, and that is being manipulated. What about the charlatans themselves? Are they all sociopaths? Do they all know that they're selling something that isn't true? Are some of them delusional? Are the ones that seem to have had fellow feeling but ended up as charlatans nonetheless? What do we know about the commonalities and the differences between the charlatans themselves?
This is a question that Moisés and I spent sort of years going back and forth on and arguing about. And when you think about it, it's actually really hard to tell because you'd have to be inside a charlatan's head, and that's the one place where you can never really be, and that they're going to be very protective of.
Well, you could by turning yourself into a charlatan.
Did I tell you that I've developed a new system for seeing inside that of a charlatan? If you just give me all your life, but so it's difficult. It's very difficult to tell. But we did find a couple of cases where I thought that we had a pretty strong sense that the charlatan really believed it, right? And I always think first of
give me an example.
Well, I think of Dr. Joseph Mercola, who is this COVID disinformation super spreader who has this like scammy supplement kingdom online. Court documents reveal his net worth is at least $100 million. We don't know how much more. He's made just a huge fortune just selling people quack medicine. So in a way, this is a throwback to the old snake oil salesman of the Old West. But doing the research for the book, we had to sit and listen to Dr. Mercola's podcast for hours and hours on end. And the guy's really, really good.
And in fact, if you want to be immune to COVID, please go to Quico Toro.
No, I mean, I'm serious. We were listening to this podcast specifically to write a book about charlatans. But at a certain point, you found yourself listening and thinking, wow, maybe I should try some magnesium. Maybe that's the problem in my life. But the place where he really got us, Yascha, is where he has this crank theory, which is not true. I talked to many doctors, all of whom will tell you this is nonsense. But he has this theory that people accumulate too much iron in their blood, and the only way to get rid of it safely is by donating blood. And so every time he had a guest on his podcast, he would sit and he would grill them. He's like, when was the last time you donated blood? You should go and donate blood. And we thought about this, and it's actually really strange because he doesn't stand to make any money from you donating blood. You donating blood is one of the best things you can do in terms of pro-social behavior, right? You're going to save people's lives. And actually, you're going to improve your own health a little bit, not for any of the reasons that he says. So he's giving people correct advice for the wrong reasons, but also in a way that he doesn't really stand to gain from personally. And we just sort of sat and, he's obviously a charlatan, but he believes it.
Well, I have two thoughts here, right? I mean, one is that in philosophy, there's a distinction between truth and true belief.
Right.
And the idea here is that some people believe things that are true, but they don't believe the things that are true for the right reasons. And we should recognize that, therefore, they don't hold the truth. So there seems to be a similar kind of thing here where he may be advocating a course of action that in fact is beneficial to the world and perhaps even has some slight benefits for you, but for the wrong reasons, and it sort of seems analogous, right?
That's exactly what it means. But
if I were to be a cynic about his motivations, though, I might say, well, that's a really smart way of pulling the wool over people's eyes. Right? If I'm if I want to get as much money out of you as possible, right? And it's a romance scam or we're just friends, right? If I never pay for anything, you're going to think pretty quickly that I'm super selfish, right? If I'm super generous to you in all kinds of ways, and then suddenly I come to you and say, hey, Quico, I need $50,000 because this horrible thing is happening in my life, you're much more likely to give me more money if I've paid for lunch every time I've seen you, right? And so isn't there sort of a little bit of an element of that where he may be saying, hey, look, yes, I tell people to buy my supplements, but I also tell people to do all kinds of things from which I'm not gaining any benefit. So therefore, you should trust my intentions, and therefore you should trust this other action I'm taking.
And that is possible. I can't rule that out because I can't climb into Joseph Mercola's head, thank God. But if so, I have to. That sounds a little too clever by half. But also, we read about a lot of charlatans. We've spent a long time looking at like these different stories, and we thought that was kind of unique in terms of we didn't see such a roundabout way. I don't know. If you listen to him, it's very difficult not to get the sense that he's just like genuinely internally convinced that unless you give blood at least 2 to 4 times a year, you're going to be very sick. And please, listener, do give blood 2 to 4 times a year. It's very important for entirely other reasons. But what I'm saying is that is one case where we felt like we had some kind of an insight into this. He seems like a true believer, but in many others, you just can't tell.
You just can't know.
You just can't tell.
Yeah, Elizabeth Holmes. I mean, did she buy her own bullshit or did she not buy her own bullshit? Did she buy it at some point and then realize that she was in over her head and then shift? Does she half believe and half not believe? It's incredibly hard to know.
Right, and there are people. I mean, we write about Arif Naqvi, who ran this private capital fund in the Middle East, investing in developing countries. Who took all kinds of very sophisticated investors for a ride, and there you do get this sense
tell us that story, because I had not heard about him before this, and it's fascinating precisely because it's not just story. Because the scale of the griftery was incredible, but because he was actually able, as I suppose was Elizabeth Holmes, to pull the wool over the eyes of very sophisticated people.
Yeah, and he seems to have been initially just an investor and a capitalist who was very good at what he did. So he was a Pakistani financier. He set up shop in Dubai. He started doing deals, buying and selling companies. And he very soon realized he was going to like Davos into these confabs of the rich and guilty, or like people who felt very guilty about their extreme elite status in society. And he realized that their dream was not about having more money, because they already had more money than they knew what to do with. Their dream was about feeling that they were doing a virtuous thing for the world's poor. And so he started targeting
while possibly making a little bit of money.
Exactly. So they're doing well by doing good. Grift is what we call it. And that's a phrase that he would use to convince people that through Abraj, his private capital equity fund, they could buy companies in developing countries, reorganize them, make a bunch of money, and end up with much more economic dynamism in poor countries and making poor people's lives better. And he does appear to have started trying to do that. It's just that slowly, as business went less well than he seemed to realize, he seems to have morphed over time into a Ponzi schemer. So it's also that people who end up acting in these very charlatan-y ways don't necessarily start out that way. And
that's true of many financial Ponzi schemes, right? I think there's ones that are like about selling things in a neighborhood or whatever that are kind of conceived of as Ponzi schemes from the beginning. And I may be getting this wrong, but I think Bernie Madoff initially was just an investor. And then at some point he wasn't able to pay people the returns that he had promised. So at that point he kind of started taking on all of these new investments in order to pay them out. He sort of pushed himself into being a Ponzi schemer, instead of going bankrupt, right? It's at the moment where you're desperate, where you're saying, right, I have to tell people, hey, I'm sorry, I screwed up. You're going to get back cents on your dollar, and I'm going to go and have an unremarkable life, that you start falsifying the books. And the only way that you can then keep going is to make it bigger and bigger and bigger. I may be misremembering the details about Madoff, but I think that was true of him as well, wasn't it?
I'm not sure about Madoff, but Charles Ponzi himself in the 1920s seems to have gone through something like this. I mean, historians disagree about this, but Ponzi did have a good idea for a good scheme to begin with. It's just that things went off the rails. So
Of all the
that
things to
seems
get
be
named
the case.
after you, by the way, it really is amazing that, I mean, Paul Ugaric, who, had great athletic achievements and then suffered, a terrible disease. What does he end up being known for? The fact that he got this terrible disease. But there's something sort of particularly strange or ironic about, being Mr. Ponzi and having all of these schemes named after you. I want to go back to the psychology piece of this. I mean, I guess I know lots of people who have dreams that they think they're about to realize. Mm-hmm. And they never are, right? They think they're about to be a great stage actor or a great novelist or a great entrepreneur. And you look at them from the outside and you think, I'm just pretty sure you don't have it, right? And most people around them seem to know that they're not going to have it, but they believe. And presumably, that is kind of if you want to have the generous interpretation of some of these charlatans that they believe themselves, this sort of, charlatans are just people like that with a better sense of how to sell some stuff, right? Like they might convince themselves that, hey, I have figured out the recipe for doing this, or I'm on the way to figuring out the recipe, or you're looking skeptical.
I mean, maybe, but after looking at many of these cases, I really don't think so, because the psychology of someone who has great or maybe outsized belief in themselves seems to me like a very normal psychology. This is what normal people do. They like get attached to things and they want to do it, and then they want the world to be different in some way. What we see in a lot of the charlatan cases, I mean, it's a little tricky because I'm not a psychologist and neither is Moisés. We can't diagnose them, but just as a general observer of human nature, if you look at the definitions of antisocial personality disorder, what we used to call psychopathy in the past, it's like inability to feel remorse, it's inability to see other people as like true subjects that deserving of respect, Machiavellianism, narcissism. You see all these like abnormal psychological traits that come back again and again and again. And so the conclusion that we come to is that the victims are normal people. There's nothing wrong with the victims. There's something wrong with the charlatans, right? Like there's an abnormal psychology to realizing the power they can have in manipulating someone's dreams and just getting off on it and like building your entire life around that. But then cross-culturally, you see that people with these dark triad traits tend to persist and tend to appear in many different societies, right?
And to thrive in many contexts. Let me think about the converse of this. So right now I was thinking about the case of somebody who's able to deceive themselves, mm-hmm. but they don't have those dark triad personality traits, right? They don't have talent for something, but I've been playing more soccer again recently, and I suddenly convinced myself that at my age, finally I'm going to become a professional soccer player, right? And it's like,
okay,
clearly not going to happen, but that's not, I'm not selling stocks in my future earnings. I'm not getting people to invest in my soccer career. I just get irrationally convinced that if only I practice enough at this point, I'm going to play for Bayern Munich, right? So clearly humans have an incredible ability to self-delude in that kind of way. And so perhaps some charlatans might be like that. You're a little bit skeptical. What about the inverse? What about people who actually are relatively competent at something? What they're selling is not a complete lie, but they have these strong dark triad personality traits that make them hugely oversell what they're doing. Because that seems to me actually to be the even bigger phenomenon, right? When I look at many politicians, when I look at many startup founders, mm-hmm. when I look at all kinds of influences online, and the things that I find most disturbing about our culture, it's neither the poor souls who deserve our compassion but don't seem very dangerous, who completely delude themselves about one day I'm gonna do X and Y, nor is it the people who run these outright scams. They're the worst, but they they have influence in certain domains. They seem they can do real damage, but that is not what most people are, right? Like what most people are is like somewhere in between. What we're selling is not completely made up. It's just vastly overhyped.
Yeah.
And they seem to share a lot of those character traits of what presumably most of the charlatans do, right? They have dark personality traits. They know exactly how to manipulate. But it's probably easier to do all of that if you have something to sell that to some extent works, right? And so isn't sort of that half charlatanism what actually is the scourge of our age?
I mean, I fully agree with all of that. That's sort of why we wanted to write the book, is because there's something about the communications landscape that we have today that turns us into a charlatanogenic culture, if you want to put it that way. It is
charlatanogenic. I like it.
I just came up with that. It just puts you in this position where it's very easy to slide into these kind of charlatan behaviors. The thing that will act as a brake on that ultimately is, do you have enough of a conscience that you feel bad if you're really manipulated, like destroying people's lives? The thing that changes over from that possibility of getting into the charlatan-like situations to outright charlatanry is that charlatans do not have that break. Like they don't feel bad when they take somebody else's savings, or when they like exploit them for sex, or when they just use them to get more political power for themselves. So we also just go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, because we have many more charlatans who are noticing little niches of belief that could be targeted, and many more ways of reaching those potential marks. That's what we think is really different, is that it used to be that if your dreams, if your core beliefs were really, really niche, they were probably too niche for anybody to bother with. But these days, that's no longer true. So one of my favorite and most amazing stories from the book is about this guy in Turkey, Mehmet Aydin, who grew up in a farm town south of Istanbul, and like in a farming community, but ended up living in the city. And he sort of he missed like the rural lifestyle and like the farming lifestyle, and he realized that there were probably millions of people in Turkey like him who miss a rural lifestyle, and who built an entire scam around this. He built this. You remember Farmville, the Facebook game? Yeah, he built he basically ripped that off, and then he layered on a whole story about how if you played this game and invested in his company, there would be real cows, that each screen cow would have a counterpart in the real world, and you would produce cheese and milk and honey and sausages and all this stuff, and then you would be able to make money off of this thing because you, even though you were living in the city, you could connect with Turkey's true farming stock. And it had never occurred to me that there are people in Istanbul and Ankara who sort of felt this way, but he knew, and these days he can target things that niche. So in the book, a lot of what we do is just try to find these people who have found niches that they know about because of their life experience, and showing how now they can be charlatans. 100 years ago, they couldn't.
Yeah, I think that is fascinating, and I enjoyed that story, which is also a wild story, and there's many wild stories in the book. I guess I'm just trying to get at sort of where do I encounter charlatans in my life. And, I have emails in my spam folder trying to sell me on all kinds of bullshit, and there's people who just lie completely. Part of it is that for those we have laws, right? Like in those cases where you're just selling something that doesn't exist, right? You're claiming there's a real world cow, and there just isn't a real world cow. We know how to deal with that. We have a machinery for dealing with that. But machinery doesn't always work. As you're emphasizing, technological developments and others make it easier for the scammers. And there's more scammers and charlatans today than there was in the past. And there's also more wealth for them to profit off of. And a lot of it are very well-oiled machines. But when I think about what really bugs me about the world, it seems to me that there are areas where people aren't really doing anything illegal. They may be driven by the same character traits. They may be exploiting what you call in the book the weaknesses of human OS, of a human operating system in the same kind of way. but they're semi-charlatans in part because they stay on the ground of what is legal. They overpromise rather than lie outright. They, there's this lovely legal concept in England called mere puff, which is that if you say I'm selling a product that is going to make you 12% slimmer, and it doesn't, you lied about the study it's based on, then I can sue you in some kind of way. If you say it's 100% good, that is considered mere puff. There's no way that I can sue you because, in fact, it's not 100% good. I think it's only 12% good, right? Not kind of. And I feel like that realm of puff is where the true charlatanogenic aspects of our society lie. So let me give you a few examples, right? I've come to recognize over time, I hope that I'm a good teacher, and I tend to get good teaching evaluations, and I enjoy teaching very much. It's one of the things that give meaning to my life. But I tend to think that the people I know who are the most popular teachers have something of a cult leader, right? They don't just go into the classroom and say, hey, we're going to talk about these important subjects. I think I'm knowledgeable about them, right? I'm going to make sure that different kinds of point of view are heard in the classroom. If all of you tend towards one kind of point of view, I'm going to try and make sure that the other point of view is well represented as well. And at the end of class, I hope that you've enjoyed the term and learned something, and that you've changed your mind about something, right? I think the people who are the most popular teachers, I don't think the best teachers, the most popular teachers are the ones who are going in saying, I have access to special, unique wisdom. And I'm the charismatic figure in this classroom. And I'm going to tell you what to think. I'm going to give you access to this ultra special thing, right? Or when I think about Persuasion is a 501c3, and so I do some amount of fundraising. I find that when I need to raise funds from somebody who I truly like and respect, it's easy because we just talk about the world and we're generally friends, and then it's hard to ask for money, but you somehow do it, and it's. But the people who are really good fundraisers, they don't just fundraise from the people with whom they just like genuinely would be friends in life, irrespective of this thing. They are able to just cater to and sell to this person and to flatter them and to, now again, they're not necessarily running a scam, right? They may be running an organization that does all kinds of decent things, right? But they overstate it. They say, this is going to transform the world. It's going to make all of the difference. I think Persuasion does very important things in the world and makes a real contribution to our public discourse, and hopefully helps give people orientation in this perilous political moment. And perhaps it might even be one of the forces that help to rebuild a kind of more moderate politics in a way that allows us to finally vanquish some of these populists. But I'm not going to say it's only because of us and we alone are going to do all of it. I think the people who are really good fundraisers, they're going to say those things, right? They're going to go and bullshit in those kind of ways. So even if I look at the pitch that some other publications on Substack and elsewhere make to their readers, right? I think our pitch is, hey, we're serious people trying to reflect seriously about the world, and hopefully we're also fun and entertaining sometimes, and hopefully we're part of an important political project, and please support us. And if you listen to this, by the way, please do that. But there's other people who are saying everybody else is lying, right, and we alone are telling you the truth. You need to come here in order to, And again, like, some of what we publish is good, right? I'm not saying like we're not like I don't know, like we're not like they shouldn't be in jail, right? We're not breaking the law, but like, how do we think about that space?
Well, look, you're getting at a lot of important themes and a lot of the research we read about, because not all charlatans are criminal, right? Like, many charlatans end up behaving in criminal ways, but one interesting thing about charlatans is that they operate out in public under their own names, right? Like, so this is something different than a fraudster, and yeah, absolutely. When you're in that kind of gray space, you have to be very careful. They're working with the things that you believe in, but it's a good thing that you believe in things. Like, if you're somebody who doesn't care about public discourse, doesn't care about a free society, then, like, Persuasion, or anybody in this case, cannot scam them, you can't get any purchase in someone who doesn't believe in anything. So I think that the thing that makes charlatans so interesting is that they're exploiting these vulnerabilities that are the things that make us really human, right? And there are the things that make human beings the interesting, fascinating, endlessly creative creatures that we are, is that, we want to see change and we want to make a better world, and we have ideas about the way the world should be. And then there's just this parasitic element of society that sees that and says, you know what? I can work with that. I can exploit that, right? So, I can a world with no charlatans. I can tell you what a world with no charlatans would be like. It's a world full of nihilists. It's a world full of people who just don't believe in anything. If you don't believe in anything, you can't be scammed. But if you don't believe in anything, you're a psychopath, and we don't want to live in that kind of world, right? So the way I think about this is that we will always have charlatans because we will always believe in people. So this is just a parasitic element in our society. And we probably can't fix it, but it's like diabetes. It's a condition you can manage and that you're going to have to manage. It's just that we're living in a society where there's just a lot more sugary treats everywhere. So managing the condition has become much more challenging. And I don't see a lot of people realizing and quite internalizing the fact that they are at risk in a way that they weren't before.
So what makes them more at risk, right? Because the psychological preconditions are kind of the same as before. Perhaps there is a way in which, as we ascend up what's it called?
Maslow.
Yes, yeah. Perhaps there's a way in which, as we ascend Maslow's hierarchy, our desires become a bigger part of what motivates us, or more high-order desires become a bigger part of what motivates us. And so therefore there's kind of more areas to attach themselves for charlatans, right? If all you want is housing and security and safety, that's your primary concern. Somebody who promises you that as well can be dangerous to you. But you'll kind of know the next day whether you've eaten something or not, right? Whereas if your desire is enlightenment or racial harmony or everlasting beauty or whatever it is, those are much more complex desires that span a much greater time frame, and so perhaps that's sort of one of the things that makes it more easier to exploit. So when that's the case, what can we do about this? I mean, is the line of defense about that to become aware of this concept and do things in our own psychology, so that you, Quico, and I, Yascha, and our listeners on this podcast see the warning signs better and find more healthy ways to fill our desires, and don't need the kind of cheap sugar rush that the charlatans are offering? Is it having better regulation and laws and ways to deal with the internet and social media and AI and all of those things? What do we do?
I think it's all of those things, but I think you're missing one really important element here, which is social isolation and screen-mediated societies. Many of the charlatans we talk about are targeting people who just are not embedded in thriving human communities, and have a lot of people around them that can serve to check their instincts, right? And so isolate. I think a major reason why we're more exposed on it is yes, we're wealthier, but we also have fewer breaks and fewer checks on our enthusiasms that way. So one thing that I think everybody should do for many reasons, and this is just one of them, is to just try to ensure that they turn off the screen, they touch grass a little bit, they volunteer at a local thing, they go do a community arts project, or volunteer at a little league team, or whatever it is. Have humans around them that when they hear a really alluring pitch, you can go, wow, I heard this guy, and then saying this and this and this, and then maybe get a second opinion or an outside perspective. Because, and the other thing that's really interesting about charlatans is that you can hear 100 charlatan pitches, and 99 of them will be aimed at people different than you, will be trying to connect with people who have dreams and pre-existing commitments that are not yours. And they always sound freaking ridiculous. You look at them, it's how could anyone fall for this very obviously scammy thing, right? And so that gives you this false sense of security, oh, I'm protected, I'm going to be okay. But it turns out that no, because if the 100th pitch is really connects with you at a time when you're isolated,
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
It's so hard. It's so cognitively hard.
I thought about this the other way around. There was a guy I went to college with who, you know, every time that somebody important was speaking on campus, and of course, you know, if you go to a good university, you have a privilege of having lots of people come through, and if you're spending your days just going to all of these talks, you can have brief conversations with many important people every week or every day. And he would go to all of those things and just flatter the shit out of him at the end. Just say, I'm a lifelong fan, you're an inspiration. And you'd always see that, right? Like, you'd always like see him run up and give the same spiel to all these people, right? Like, any talk by anybody influential there I ever went to, just out of interest, he would always be there, and he would always pull this stunt, right? And of course, you could see 9 out of 10 of them look, you know, a little embarrassed and, you know, sort of glock onto the fact that this guy was a little bit weird and sort of politely smile and say, well, thank you, that's very nice, and sort of get on with their lives and forget about him 20 minutes later, right? But 1 in 10 would fall for it. And 1 in 10, you know, and then he would brag about, oh, I'm emailing with so-and-so, you know, and so it's a numbers game, right? And I'd thought about it as the numbers game for the charlatan, right? And I think he was a kind of charlatan. But of course, it's also a numbers game for the adversary of the charlatans, right? You might be really smart at sniffing out 99 out of 100 charlatans, but some charlatan is gonna have the charm, have the thing they speak to, you know, meet you at your lowest moments, and they might be able to prey on you in that way. That's a really good point.
Yeah, and one thing that's interesting is that different charlatans have different models. Some are trying to play a mass game and trying to exploit millions of people a little bit. But we also have charlatans in the book that are very, very niche and that are only really interested in getting like 30 or 50 people in the world to like join them, but then to like really go very deep and to sort of turn over their lives to them. And here you start going more into cult territory. But yeah, the thing that bothers a charlatan the least is if you laugh off their pitch, because they're used to that. That's just baked into it. They know that their pitch is not meant to win people over who weren't already won over. It's a discovery device.
Since you mentioned laughing them off, I think some people might fancy, and perhaps some cultures like Brits who, you know, like to make fun of things, but they're more immune to charlatanism because they have a kind of sardonic sense of humor. That perhaps Americans can fall for charlatans because they're earnest and they believe in big dreams, whereas a more cynical culture like the English somehow has weapons against that. The first, because you know, humor is a great way of taking somebody down a peg and exposing their grift, and often there is something ridiculous about these charlatans, and then perhaps because if you come from a culture where you don't allow yourself to dream big, then you might be more protected against it. Is there any evidence for that? There's some cultures that are more resistant to charlatans than others, or maybe that actually if you come from a culture that's so cynical, etc., the one person who's able to light up that fire of hope in you then becomes, you know, all the more successful. You become all the more defenseless against their schemes.
I mean, we didn't find any evidence or any research on this question. I wonder how you would do it. But I tend to be skeptical in that even cultures that sort of superficially present as quite cynical or detached, like if you scratch a little bit and you get past that first outer layer of cynicism, you're always going to find that people are like really committed to a certain, like, it's just a normal part of human cognition. Like a person who genuinely cannot be reached by a charlatan's pitch, almost by definition, there's something very weird about them, right? And you wouldn't want to be friends with that person because like that is not normal psychology. So, in a way, I take a bit. I don't think I've ever really been taken by a charlatan, but like there's been a few where I've been, you know, very curious or like given to thinking, well, this is a good idea. Like Nagvi, you know, like I believe in capitalism and free markets, and so a guy like that is going to make a pitch that, like, to me, if I'd heard it at the time, I probably would have thought that was quite interesting. But I take a kind of pride in being scammable, right? We should wear that as a badge of pride. That just means that you're a normal person, right? Like people who take pride in being unscammable, I'm much more worried about them.
Oh, interesting, because it's so cynical. There's the big story a little while ago about a finance writer for New York Magazine who ended up being scammed for money and writing a viral piece about it. And a lot of people on the internet both made fun of her. You're supposed to be this personal finance writer, so how can you end up being scammed in this way? And then there was a fascinating response piece to this, which involved a lot of reporting, because one of the parts of her being scammed is that she showed up at her bank and asked for $50,000 or some really very large sum. And what this writer said is that made me think that she might have made that whole story up, because you go to your bank and you ask for $50,000. They're not going to give it to you. And this writer presented herself in this article as kind of, like a freelance writer or a columnist or whatever exactly her job title is, living in Brooklyn with limited means. And so they're saying, you show up to your local branch of Bank of America, which it was, and you ask, I need $50,000 today. All of the alarms go off and they say, no, why do you need it today? We can give it to you in a couple of days. Explain the situation to us. And so how did she manage to get this money? And the answer was a much smaller scam that the writer was pulling on her readers, which is that it does in fact appear that all of this happened. There is a branch by exactly the description that she gave, but it turns out that she comes from a lot of money and she is a trustee of a major charity. And the reason why the bank didn't sort of bat an eyelid about handing over $50,000 is that she has signing authority on bank accounts probably worth millions of dollars. And so the bank said, all right, well, 50,000 is not that much.
Does surprise me, really. Yeah. No, I don't know. I think we are too quick to judge people who get taken in by charlatans. And a lot of what we're trying to do in the book is work on people's just capacity to empathize and to see themselves in the position of the victim, and to not to be so quick to judge, because that quickness to judge in a weird way ends up just exposing you more, right?
But I guess so as a society, we might not want to live in the kind of place where nobody is ever going to fall foul to a scam, because it would mean that we're all so cynical and so skeptical and so pessimistic that there's probably lots of negative externalities. What about at the individual level? Should we cultivate the kind of skepticism that leads to that? I have a question here from my producer, Leo, who's saying, is there anything to learn from charlatans? Would I be more successful if I were a psychopath?
Of course. I mean, you wouldn't. I don't think you would want to work. You cannot fake psychopathy, right? If you're not a psychopath and you try to pretend that you are, you'll only drive yourself insane. This is not a recipe that can be followed, right? Because
you can't learn to be a psychopath. Incredibly, psychopaths can learn to pass themselves off as not being psychopaths.
Oh, very easily. Yeah, that's not hard for them at all. There's a lot of evidence that psychopaths tend to excel in a lot of fields, because obviously if you don't worry at all about the consequences of your behavior and other people's actions, just playing life on easy mode, right? And a lot of political leaders obviously have some signs of psychopathy. Some evolutionary psychologists have posited, and this is very controversial, but that it may be good for society in times of crisis to be led by someone who is willing to make sort of inhuman choices for the good of the collectivity, right? And that as somebody with a more normal psychological makeup might not be the best leader in the time of crisis. And some evolutionary psychologists propose that is why there is a stable supply of psychopaths in all societies, as far as we know, because there is an evolutionary payoff to having that pool of talent available there. In some cases, a lot of evolutionary psychology.
Well, presumably the main evolutionary explanation here must be at the individual rather than the group level. It's just that if you're a psychopath, you can manipulate people and so on, and all of that means that you're better at getting resources, and you may, in fact, even be more successful at finding romantic partners and passing on your genes.
Definitely. I mean, if you don't mind lying a lot, it's a lot easier to get laid, of course. That's just kind of obvious. But the broader point to me here is that, yeah, this is not the kind of success that normal people would want, right? Like this is a definition of success that is deeply pathological. So, and the individual level, what we can do is honestly kind of limited, right? So you can try to like keep enough actual human relationships in your life that you have that second thought there. So that I think is very important. But the other part of this, what you really need to do internally, psychologically within yourself, is very easy to say, but almost impossible to do, which is that you need to hold your own deepest commitments at arm's length every so often, not to reject them, but to understand them the way a psychopath and a charlatan sees them, which is as a vulnerability that could be exploited. So you take that level of self-awareness, like, I really care about this. I'm not going to stop really caring about this, but I also understand that just the fact of caring about this thing so much puts me at risk. And that is a very sophisticated kind of cognitive move that I don't think everybody can handle it. I don't think anybody can handle it consistently. I don't know anyone who can do that all the time, which is why I think we're all at risk.
Your argument against wanting to be a psychopath, and as you point out, in a way it's a moot question because you can't learn to be a psychopath, reminds me of one of my favorite arguments in philosophy by Bernard Williams about a similar topic, about why we shouldn't be egotists, which I guess is related to psychopathy. And what he's saying, there's this long philosophical debate about, can we find transcendental reasons for why you shouldn't be just self-serving, why there are these objective moral rules and laws which show you why you should be altruistic in certain ways, or to some extent. And Bernard Williams says, look, we're not going to find those, but that's irrelevant. What I can tell you is, what kind of life it leads to be an egotist, right? If you are a complete egotist, you're incapable of enjoying friendship and love and other social goods that actually are really meaningful to most people. And some people may still have a psychological predilection to go there, and we're never going to convince them with a moral argument. But for most of humanity, that is reason enough to not want to be an egotist, right? There are rewards in what it means to care for a friend, to care for a romantic partner, to care for a child, to care for a pet, to be part of a broader life project, which means that the success of your life is in some ways entangled with something beyond yourself, that give meaning and structure to your life. And those are the reasons why you shouldn't be an egotist. And they are not, if all of that doesn't matter to you, if you say, I don't care about any of that, we're not going to find some objective argument that convinces you.
Yeah.
But we don't really need to.
Yeah, I mean, it's philosophers are weird, and that seems to me like a very strange way to discuss the argument, because these things are not the subject of rational consideration normally, I don't think. I mean, I think for people who are basically psychologically normal, this is both inevitable and entirely a given. And to the point where if you're unable to act on those insights, that is kind of prima facie evidence that you have a badly disordered personality, and probably a personality disorder. So which is why I think that this question of egotism and psychopathy are linked. And I think Bernard Williams, I think what you just said is sort of, Bernard Williams has a more highfalutin way of saying the same thing, but I think that is the answer to it. Why should I not be an egotist? And Williams says, well, A, because we're made that way, and B, because your life would be really impoverished if you were an egotist, right? We've touched a little bit on politics, but not very much. Tell us about the role of charlatans in politics, particularly today. I mean, we do at one point in the book come out and say there is a specter haunting the pages of this book, and it's a specter of Donald Trump, right? There's simply no way around this very striking, very weird, but unmistakable reality that a straight up charlatan now leads the most powerful country in the world. And to make that case, we don't actually look at the political Trump at all. We sort of stop the clock in January 1st, 2015, and we look, I mean, we could have looked at many, but we look specifically at the case of Trump University, which was this very scammy real estate investment school that Trump claimed to be leading. It was not chartered as a university. The state of New York sent many cease and desist letters to the Trump organization saying that it was illegal to call it a university. They moved to a different state rather than stop calling it a university, and they took thousands of students for a ride with this like persistent upsell and like drawing them into this dream of learning the secrets of wealth from one of the most successful real estate investors in the world. And when you read the victim statements from the people who were victimized by Trump University, you'll realize that if Donald Trump had been run over by a bus on January 2015, we would already have everything we would have needed to put him in this book. So, Trump obviously looms large over this debate. We didn't want to write a ranting anti-Trump book because there are already too many of those and they're basically boring. But we did hope that people would start to understand the Trump phenomenon through the categories laid out in the book, and to understand why people who are being exploited for political power through what the Republican Party has become will nevertheless be the most passionate defenders of Trump, because Trump has managed to convince many people that he has only AI can fix it, he has special abilities and special powers that nobody else has, and that the vision of a good America, the vision of an America that's great again, that dream that many of his supporters have, is only achievable through the mediation of Donald Trump. So there are others where... Mm-hmm.
In the same way in which so much of our culture is charlatanogenic, isn't that also true of our politics? I mean, it strikes me that in some political systems, particularly in ones that aren't presidential, and where there's therefore somewhat as hero worship of one individual politician, it's a perfectly reasonable pitch to go to the population and say, I want to form a government, I have a few ideas about what to do, I hope things are going to get better, at least we're going to try and do what we can to stop them from getting worse. I'm a competent person, I've been in government before, I don't have extreme values. I think if I get to steward the ship, it's going to be fine, right? And Angela Merkel won, 3 elections like that, 4 elections like that. That is sometimes running its course because it obviously also leaves the field open for people with more exciting pitches. But in certain political cultures, that more or less works. In American political culture, that is rarely what the president said. When I go to one of the politicians I still most admire in the United States, Barack Obama, he came in and said, I'm going to be transformative. I'm going to completely change how things are done in Washington, D.C. I am the personification of hope that this is going to be a big juncture in American politics. He said, and I think it's a slightly unfair thing to quote because it really is one of his sillier lines, and he usually was much more thoughtful than that. On the night he was elected, I believe, this is the day in which the oceans are going to start to recede, right? I think there is obviously a real difference between Obama and Trump. I wouldn't call Obama a charlatan, and it is intuitive to me to call Trump a charlatan. But where here is the difference? I mean, is it sort of in the seriousness of the policy proposals they had underneath those things? Is it the scale of their deception? Is it this thing which to me sounds like one of the hallmarks of populism rather than of being a charlatan, of like, I alone am legitimate, only I can fix it, and everybody else is illegitimate, which is something that Trump says but that Obama didn't say. Where does the difference lie between the kind of semi-charlatanism that the American political culture seems to demand of everybody, that it's not enough to just say, I'm a smart person, I'm going to work hard, I'll do some things right and some things wrong, and, I think I'm better than the other guy. But you kind of have to make these outsized promises, and that is a kind of charlatanism, and all of them do that all of the time because that's what the voters want.
Sure. I mean, to me, the difference is in the basic attitude of contempt to the marks. Like, and this is something you see very commonly, is that just beneath the surface, you see the charlatans understand on some level that they are manipulating and exploiting their marks. And that's very clear from reporting about Donald Trump and we read about Silvio Berlusconi in the book, who I think is in many ways that like the original pattern of the 21st century political charlatan. Obama was interested in delivering on these promises. He might have over-egged them. He might have been wildly optimistic in some cases, but it's very hard for me to imagine a case where Obama is self-consciously manipulating and exploiting marks and kind of callously.
But Trump wants to make America great again. I don't think that's what drives him at the most fundamental level, but that's a different kind of question. And perhaps this is just that Trump is one of the charlatans who believes himself. He certainly wants to get rich too, and he is a narcissist and he enjoys power. But I don't think that Trump looks in the mirror at night and says, "Actually, I don't want to make America great again." But he looks at his voters and his supporters, and he can't believe how easy it is to take these chumps in the same way that he looks at the people who gave him sometimes $30,000-$40,000 for a completely worthless 3-day course on real estate secrets that weren't either legal or secret in the first place, and just laughs at them and puts their money in their pockets. And this is something that you commonly see with charlatans, which is this understated contempt for the marks and this inability to believe that they're getting away with it. That is a disordered personality. That is not a normal, psychologically healthy people don't enjoy ruining other people's lives. So, if you're thinking about the rise of a lot of these political figures that I would probably call populists, you probably would also call them populists in different kind of contexts, as charlatans. What does that tell us about how our desires have changed, right? If you're saying that we are more susceptible to charlatans if we have these deep desires that haven't been fulfilled, then one way of thinking about this political moment is that if we see charlatans rising in all of these different countries, it must be because there's some set of collective desires that our political system was comparatively better at fulfilling a few decades ago than it is now. And we're now uniquely able to prey on those different collective desires. So is there some other explanation for why charlatans seem to be thriving in our politics more than they were 30 or 50 years ago?
I think they're finding it easier to suss out desires that were there but couldn't be explained in a different technological and communications order, right? I think if you look at Archie Bunker, I think there were plenty of nativists in the U.S. in the 1960s and 70s, of course. But without the internet, without 800 channels on TV, without this explosion in technological connectedness, it was very difficult for a charlatan to connect directly with those people because there were far fewer channels to do that. You would have to do it through the mail. People tried. You had things like the John Birch Society that tried to do that, but that was clunky and slow process for creating those kind of links. So it became a kind of it slowed down the process, and it blunted the effect of charlatanism on a social basis. Now, when you take away all of the friction that was preventing charlatans from connecting with their marks, you have the kind of free-for-all that we have not only in politics, but in wellness and health and spirituality and crypto and all these other things. And then you end up with things. Well, we have a chapter, it's one of the weirder chapters in the book, on QAnon. So you end up with very strange phenomena. QAnon is a kind of charlatanism without a central charlatan. It's like distributed charlatanism, where the game was the game was that everyone was going to everybody could be a charlatan for 15 minutes within this community of people making up insane stories and passing them to each other without any technological friction at all. So that is one of, like, it's strange that we haven't seen a recrudescence of QAnon in 2025, which I find actually very hard to understand. But I think QAnon will be remembered as the first of a kind, the first of a pattern of distributed charlatanism that I don't know which way it's going to go, but I do know it's unsettling and quite scary, really.
So we talked earlier about how charlatans are always going to be with us, but there's things we can do to reduce their impact. Presumably the same is true of politics. Politics has always had charlatans in it and is always going to have charlatans in it. But what is your explanation for why they have become so much better able at sussing out and exploiting our deepest desires? Tell us about how we can hopefully move through this age of charlatanism in our politics.
Boy, do I have to answer this question. This one makes me very uneasy because I don't know the answer, and the signs I see point in the direction of things getting worse and not better. And you know me very well, Yascha. I'm an optimist. I don't like to come to these kinds of conclusions, but it's, especially now with AI, it's very easy to imagine the way you can use a large language model to sort of mass customize charlatan pitches and to create this kind of synthetic intimacy between a charlatan and a mark. Right? I think we haven't, in a way, seen yet a charlatan who's really, really adept at using AI to scale up their pitch and to scale up the victimization that they're able to do. But it's hard for me to imagine that won't happen.
On that hopeful note, Quico Toro, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, I guess.